Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to have worked on the Justice Committee with my colleagues from all parties on Bill C-36, and I am also very pleased to rise in this House today to talk about it, to debate it, to talk about the testimony that we heard before the committee during the study of Bill C-36, and to make my comments on that topic as well. First, Mr. Speaker, allow me to explain briefly the bill as such and the contribution it will make to the criminal code. This bill is entitled the Protecting Canada's Seniors Act, and it adds an element that reads as follows. Evidence that the offence had a significant impact on the victim, considering their age and other personal circumstances, including their health and financial situation. This specific wording that has been suggested as an addition to the criminal code under C-36 seek to add an element that would allow the court to take into consideration certain aggravating factors of an offence. Therefore, in Clause 718.2, it says that the court determines the sentence to be handed down, taking into account certain principles. And then certainly aggravating circumstances are set out. For example, hate crimes, crimes based on the victim's ethnic origin or their sexual orientation. Those factors are taken into account when considering the sentence that will be handed down, whether the sentence will be heavier because there was an aggravating factor. For example, the abuse of trust or authority is another factor that should be taken into consideration as an aggravating factor. So what we're adding here is another element that is the age of the victim and the degree of vulnerability of that victim based on their personal situation. So I'm not saying that the age of the victim is as such an aggravating circumstance, because age in itself is not a vulnerability factor, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to point that out. But sometimes certain victims, certain actions can have more considerable impacts because of the person's age and personal situation. Now, here's an example. In committee, we heard from Ms. Perka, who is a supervisor of social programs for an elder abuse program. It came to testify, and she said that based on her long experience in this area, she stated that we have seen that health problems from a social and spiritual aspect can incite anxiety, suicidal ideas, and other mental problems. Elders who are abused can feel very guilty because sometimes the perpetrator is a friend, a family, or a very close relative. So I think that what Ms. Pelka is telling us here is that if the victim is an elderly person who is particularly vulnerable because of their situation, their housing situation, for example, they may be dependent upon a friend or a residential center for housing, well then, it is possible that this abuse means that they might have to move, but they can't do that because of their financial situation, and perhaps their social network is very important to them. And so that person the impacts are greater on that person because that person has limitations with regard to the possibility of moving, for example, in order to avoid said abuse. So that is simply a factor, Mr. Speaker, to show you the needs that were identified by the various players when they were recommending the measures that the government should put in place based on the vulnerability of the person's situation, considers as aggravating factors. So that's just what I wanted to show you.
So that's the real impact that the bill will have, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'd like to say that this is an additional tool that can be used when sentencing occurs. So the age of a person can be used. We hope that it will give the judge the tools that he or she needs. We can't confirm that. There was some doubt expressed in that regard, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to say that we hope these additions will have an impact, and I've explained why they're important. But what are the limits of these measures? Now, earlier, a colleague said that in the wording of the bill, there's a mention of important effects. Now, we don't know exactly what that will mean. What does that mean exactly? How do you prove that something is significant, a significant impact? How can you prove it? How do you define it? So that's one of the concerns that we have. We would have liked the government to take that aspect a little more seriously. Now, Mr. Speaker, we also need to be careful about something else. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like it to say that the legal process is a very long one. We have to follow it all the way through for elder abuse. Now, why do I say that? Because 1 out of every 5 cases of elder abuse is identified, denounced, and I mentioned this earlier. Why is that? Not all seniors or elders live or experience this situation, but many have trouble denouncing the situation. Most of the time, the abuse comes from people they know, family, friends, and it's very difficult for seniors to denounce a situation like that. The denunciation can have very serious consequences for vulnerable seniors because of their finances, their health, or where they live. So the denunciation is something that's very difficult. Once a case has been denounced, Mr. Speaker, we have to prove that an offense has occurred, and that's not always easy because elder abuse can happen can take various shapes and forms. Some people or some types of abuse don't leave tracks, like intimidation, for example. Sometimes it's difficult to prove manipulation and intimidation or bullying. That can be difficult to prove. But if abuse is proved and there's some police involvement, a file is put together to subsequently make or launch a formal complaint and take the matter to court. Now, if there isn't an out-of-court settlement and this goes right through to the end of the legal procedure, that is where C-36 will come into play. Now, I agree with the bill, with Bill C-36, with its purpose and with what it can accomplish. But we need to bear in mind that it's not a solution that will help the majority of seniors who are experiencing abuse because of the process that I just identified, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to quote Ms. Beaulieu from the Center that deals with elder abuse at the University of Sherbrooke, and I quote, "We all understand that many cases of elder abuse may not make it all the way through this process. What happens about seniors who cases don't go all the way through? In other words, what will the real repercussions of this measure be? How many cases will it concern?" End of quote. So that's a first concern with respect to the impact of the bill. I'd like to draw another one to your attention, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, I said that an aspect is indeed being added to the criminal code. However, legal stakeholders need to have resources to be able to use this effectively. Do they have that? Now, what do I mean by these comments? First of all, the frontline responders and police who receive the complaints. There are some specific aspects of the complaints that need to be taken into account for several reasons, Mr. Speaker. Some of them I've already mentioned. What do you do when a senior comes to you but doesn't want to admit that he or she is a victim of abuse? How to process it, to not make the senior afraid, to have the person abandon the procedure because he or she feels intimidated. Those are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And those measures would need to be put in place, in fact, to ensure that Bill C-36 meets its objective. Then there's also the issue of training for judges, lawyers, to identify the subtle comments made by seniors. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to once again quote Ms. Litwick from the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal, who's very involved in the issue of elder abuse. I challenge the way that this bill will be enforced. I am afraid that for this type of bill to be effective, prosecutors will have to recognize issues affecting seniors and the subject of elder abuse. Judges must also know how to ask relevant questions. Plans also have to be put in place for dealing with these issues before the court, because seniors will not give evidence like a young person. All of these aspects can be very different. Ms. Litwick has made comments in support of what I'm presenting here today, aspects that need to be taken into account when discussing elder abuse, to ensure that the process flows smoothly, that the consequences aren't detrimental to the person who is lodging the complaint, and for this be as beneficial as possible for the victim. Bill C-36, yes, but how to ensure that it can be implemented effectively and to ensure that it meets its objectives. Now I have provided some excellent suggestions on this. Now, Mr. Speaker, allow me to say a few words about prevention and intervention. I couldn't overlook those two aspects. A bill that applies to seniors and is called Protecting Seniors Act, Mr. Speaker, should logically protect seniors, but I have some doubt with respect to that. I'm not sure that the word protection, in fact, is the best choice here, Mr. Speaker. The sentences need to be commensurate with the situation. How will this bill protect seniors? I'm not sure that sentencing is a good tool for protecting seniors. There's a great deal that needs to be done to protect seniors from abuse, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to quote some other evidence we heard in our consideration of Bill C-36. Ms. Santos from the Lawyers Association of Ontario said, because many cases of elder abuse are not identified or brought to the attention of our association, we encourage the adoption of a multi-pronged approach which focuses on effective prevention of causes of elder abuse and vulnerability, such as social housing, lack of housing, and poverty. What I retain from that, Mr. Speaker, is the adoption of a multi-pronged approach. And that is the way one of the witnesses put it. Susan Angus from CARP put it differently. The words she used were as follows. Bill C-36 is simply one aspect of the global strategy to deal with elder abuse. A comprehensive global strategy is what she talked about. Adopting a multi-pronged approach, a comprehensive strategy. It can be called a number of things, Mr. Speaker, but I think the point itself is very clear. We need a strategy to deal with elder abuse. It seems to me that it's like we're trying to take some pieces of a puzzle, we're trying to put Band-Aids on major wounds without really considering what the long-term impacts will be, the repercussions, or what steps should be taken in order to achieve the best possible results. Bill C-36 is part of what strategy, Mr. Speaker? We still don't have the answer to that. What does the government plan to do in terms of training for stakeholders in the legal system to ensure the bill meets its objective? What will be put in place in terms of prevention, intervention, so that elders who are abused can denounce the situation if that's what they intend to do? And we don't know what the government plans to do that, and that is a shortcoming. We need a comprehensive strategy outlining the thrust, the clear objectives, and the means used to achieve that. It's incredible that we still haven't received that information. I'd like to refer to an interesting report that was produced by the Committee on Palliative Care. It was a committee that was set up and represented, or in fact had many members from different parties on it, and it contains a chapter on elder abuse, and they called it a hidden crime in Canada, Mr. Speaker. In this chapter of the report, Mr. Speaker, they talk about a Canada action plan to combat elder abuse. One of the suggestions that should be considered by this government deals with an action plan, not an isolated measure, Mr. Speaker, as beneficial as it may be, but a broader, more comprehensive, long-term, sustainable approach. This suggestion contains 4 points, Mr. Speaker. First of all, awareness, raising awareness so that people can identify and recognize signs of elder abuse, so that seniors and elders themselves can recognize that they are being abused, so information for everyone who can be involved in a solution. Secondly, prevention. Information isn't enough. Prevention is also very important. So, for example, by breaking down elder isolation, by supporting caregivers, and I could name a number of other aspects, Mr. Speaker. So that means we can't simply punish the crime once it's occurred. There are other aspects that need to be put in place before the crime is committed. And then we could really talk about protecting seniors. Protection before the crime has been committed, not simply after the fact, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to quote something that the committee says. It's very worthwhile. It can help us draw a link with the debate that we heard today. The committee feels that basic funding for non-governmental organizations is essential to build the necessary infrastructure in order to reduce elder abuse. When will we see that, Mr. Speaker? I'm eager to know. Very impatient to see it, in fact, because that is something that can make a difference. Non-governmental, not-for-profit organizations are in the field. They're frontline responders. They can identify the needs and assess the needs of their communities quickly and effectively. Mr. Speaker, the third and fourth points in the report by the Standing Committee are putting in place advocacy measures so that people can know how to defend themselves, and fourthly, developing adequate legal measures. C-36 is the fourth component of this strategy recommended by the committee. And there's also training for other players in the legal field, including police officers and frontline workers. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to mention a couple of the challenges in the views of certain witnesses. challenges for new seniors who are newcomers to Canada, who aren't familiar with their laws, who don't necessarily trust the Canadian legal system. Then we need to think about their specific needs. There are also gay and lesbian and transgendered seniors. They are very vulnerable. All of that to say, Mr. Speaker, there remain a great deal of action that is required. A lot of measures need to be taken. This is a step, but a step towards what? We need a strategy that the government will put in place for the long term. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Some comments. Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Gatineau.
The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Pierrefonds-Dollard for all of the work that she has been doing on the issue of protecting seniors and to make us aware of these issues. Once Bill C-36 is adopted, I wonder what my colleague would like to send in terms of a message to the government to ensure that the bill will apply or be enforced Canada-wide from sea to sea to sea, taking into account our partners in the combat to end elder abuse, police forces in the provinces, municipal police forces. So what kind of intervention does she think the government needs to put in place to ensure that this bill is worth more than the ink and the paper that it's written on? The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her question. Oftentimes, the government comes out with legislation that's designed to meet the needs of the community, but when we scratch below the surface, we see that it's just a smokescreen, and more concrete action could be taken in order to help people in communities, but that's not the case. I'm not saying that that is the case with C-36. It is pertinent, but if we don't include it as part of a global strategy, I doubt really what kind of impact it will have. Our colleague has clearly identified the situation. If we want to build C-36 to be effective, if we wanted to meet its objectives, then we need to think about training that needs to be put in place for police forces, for lawyers, for all other players involved in the legal system, Mr. Speaker. We need to take into account training to ensure that we can fully benefit from what C-36 is designed to do.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby New Westminster.
Merci beaucoup, Mr.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the member for Gatineau has just said, I'd like to underscore the important work being done by the member for Pierrefonds-Dollard for Canadians, for the members of this House, by drawing our attention to these important issues. Now, we are supporting this bill. However, there are other measures that the government has put forth, or could put forth, in fact, for vulnerable seniors. But what they've done is extended retirement from 65 to 67. They've put in place huge cuts for seniors in terms of access to government services. So because this vulnerability or the situation makes seniors more vulnerable, I'd like the member to say a few words about what this government is doing. The seniors feel more vulnerable because of the government. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Well, that's a very interesting question from my colleague. If the government is really serious about wanting to deal with elder abuse, then a great deal of work needs to be done. They need to do a number of things that they haven't yet done. What about prevention and intervention, Mr. Speaker? If we want to deal with seniors, help them overcome elder abuse, we need to reduce vulnerability. What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Well, we need to deal with things such as poverty. But pushing off eligibility for the OAS from 65 to 67 won't help. That's going to extend poverty among seniors, Mr. Speaker. That will not help deal with elder abuse.
Another example, seniors count on the healthcare system a great deal at some points in their lives. Well, Mr. Speaker, when you reduce the percentage of transfer payments expected by the provinces, you can only wonder When people depend on the healthcare system, will they have access to a good, reliable system? I'd have many other examples. Affordable housing, for instance. It's important to make sure that seniors have access to adapted housing and affordable housing. That could be a factor in vulnerability. I want to point out that being a senior does not mean you're automatically vulnerable, but if we want to tackle elder abuse, we have to take into account the factors of vulnerability that lead to abuse. And right now this government is increasing the factors of vulnerability, which is very disappointing. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened carefully to my colleague's speech on their fourth point of access, or action rather. She mentioned the particular problem of vulnerability regarding senior immigrants who do not speak French and English. Many of them arrive young and have an opportunity to learn both official languages, but those who arrive in Canada older, when they haven't had an opportunity to learn French or English, are in a very vulnerable situation. So I'd like my colleague to discuss that problem, which is a quite specific one. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for his question. Indeed, seniors who are new arrivals, who don't necessarily speak French or English, are vulnerable in some ways that have to be taken into account. The Director General of the Social Services Network appeared before our committee during the consideration of C-36, and she said that yes, indeed, one must make sure that seniors have the necessary services to get access to the legal system. They have to understand their rights in this country, Canada. They have to know that they can trust the police. They have to have access to information and services. Sometimes they have to overcome the language barrier, which is an obstacle in and of itself. So yes, there are many particular features of seniors who are new arrivals in Canada. We have to make sure that they too have rights and access to services and dignity, Mr. Speaker. Until now, I haven't heard any measures on the part of this government that would take into account such situations. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, my colleague for Bon-Missisquoi asked a question to a Conservative government, asking him why his government did not want to invest some money to get seniors out of poverty. The Conservative member didn't understand the question, so I wanted to put it again, and I was surprised by the response by the Conservative, who said that, in his opinion, all seniors, be they rich or poor, are subject to elder abuse, so the government does not have the will to lift seniors out of poverty. So I wonder if my New Democrat colleague could tell me whether she feels that her values mean that the government should help lift seniors out of poverty through various measures. She talked about a strategy. I'd like her to explain how, in concrete terms, the NDP would lift seniors out of poverty. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, right now in Canada, too many seniors are living in poverty. In a country like ours, that's unacceptable. We have a choice to help those people rise out of poverty. We have the ability to do so. It's certainly not by pushing back access to OAS from 65 to 67 that will achieve that goal, Mr. Speaker. Right now, an older person who receives the guaranteed income supplement and the OAS as their only income lives under the poverty line. The government has not put in place the measures necessary to ensure that seniors can continue to contribute fully to their communities and live in dignity. We should not accept the fact that a senior today has to make a choice between paying the rent, getting their medication, or buying food. It's indecent that that kind of choice be endorsed. when we have the power to do otherwise. How? We could increase the GIS for all those who need it. Another measure, Mr. Speaker? Protecting pensions. Right now, we can strengthen protection on pensions in case of bankruptcy, and this government is not doing that. We have many suggestions to protect seniors' financial security, and we hope to see a little bit more openness by this government on this subject.